Thanks very much for staying with us, this sort of Friday period 5. The G&T amongst you will have noticed that I'm not Rob Peel, as previously advertised. Rob is elsewhere. And consequently, Catherine had to look at her sort of go-to list of Gove supporting teachers. As you can imagine, it wasn't a long list. And here I am. I started teaching in Birmingham, in the area of Birmingham now sort of synonymous with the sort of so-called Trojan horse affair. There were loads of things that we didn't know as trainees. We didn't really know what we were going to teach tomorrow. We didn't know how to break up a fight and differentiate 5 ways. And we didn't know what level 5 was. But there was one thing we were absolutely sure about. Michael Gove was bad. Now, as time went on, and as these things tend to, this sort of Manichaean view of the world that sort of saw Gove as evil and sort of every other teacher as some sort of saintly martyr changed somewhat. And what I'm here today to say is that I'm not some sort of frothing at the mouth ideologue who cannot see where Gove got it wrong. I don't think he was perfect, far from it. I mean, I think his handling of the Building Schools for the Future programme, for example, was pretty misguided. I think that the pace and the tempo of many of his reforms was often at the expense of important deliberation. And I think that his rhetoric was at times polemical and often hurtful and demoralising. So I'm not here to tell you that he was a perfect education secretary. Far from it. All I'm going to tell you today is that he was a great Education Secretary. And I'm going to do that by making 2 main points. The first is that he lifted expectations. He said that our poor children can do what our rich children can do. Second, he created a system and a culture in which innovation, enterprise, and evidence will and is flourishing. First, some important context. Michael Gove came to office on the back of 5 education secretaries whose tenure on average had lasted less than 2 years. England was the only country in the developed world where literacy and numeracy amongst the 16 to 24-year-olds was no higher than it was between the 55 and the 65-year-olds. In 2011, only 4% of children on free school meals at the age of 15 proceeded to a Russell Group university. And although Britain was the 6th largest economy, we were 21st in science, 23rd in reading, and 26th in maths. Between 1997 and 2010, there had been no or negligible improvement in standards. Rather than expecting all children to do what their own children could do, policymakers created a raft of pseudo-qualifications, such as study skills, nail technology, and one that I have experience with, the Certificate of Personal Effectiveness. Now, these were qualifications created by policymakers for other people's children. It was a charade. They weren't equivalents at all. We were told they were equivalents, but they weren't equivalents at all. And all the while, we are told that standards are going up and up and up. But this isn't true. As Rob Cove from the University of Durham has said, the best I think we can say is that overall there has probably not been much change. And this was despite, ladies and gentlemen, a doubling in education funding over the period. Why? It was because the prevailing answer to the question of why poor children fail in this country was money. Now, I think money's really important. I certainly would love to be paid even more, and I'm sure you do as well. But it's not the only thing in education, and it certainly, on its own, won't lead to better standards. It must be matched with the right ideas. So, what did Michael Gove do? First, he raised expectations. He introduced a more rigorous primary curriculum. He introduced the statutory phonics screening check at the end of year 1. Now, I would argue this is one of the few areas of government policy where Michael Gove and the coalition government prescribed exactly how teachers were going to teach. And I think that there's a very good reason for this. It's because the evidence surrounding systematic synthetic phonics is overwhelming. And I cannot think of another policy that has done more to improve the life chances of our poorest children. In secondary, GCSEs and A-levels were made more difficult. No longer can I get away with teaching my GCSE pupils to get a C in GCSE RE, spouting out love thy neighbour in almost any circumstance. In history, the breadth of the curriculum has changed. Our pupils now study things that go beyond this sort of tried and tested Stalin, Second World War, and Cold War. The accountability measures were changed, including EBAC, which, although flawed in places, has put an emphasis on some STEM subjects, maths, science, and the like. And Michael Gove improved the national curriculum by going further because he specified exactly what it was that the teacher should impart. There were fewer of the nebulous skills-based descriptors. When I was researching for the debate, I compared the primary curriculum in 2000 with the primary curriculum as we currently have it. In 2000, the pupils were, and I quote directly, to study a range of places and environments in different parts of the world, including the UK and the EU. Pretty broad. In the new curriculum, it identifies it as such. Locate the world's countries using maps. Name and locate counties and cities in the UK. Identify the position and significance of latitude, longitude, the equator, the northern hemisphere, tropics of Cancer, Capricorn, the Arctic and the Antarctic Circle, and the Prime and Greenwich Meridian. Michael Gove knew that it's only rich children who pick up this knowledge through osmosis. And like money, knowledge is something that it's easy to take for granted if you have lots of it. In doing so, he democratized knowledge. He took it from the few and gave it to the many. My second point, ladies and gentlemen, is that he created a system and a culture where good ideas can flourish. Although Gove was highly prescriptive about the outputs of the system, he was much less prescriptive about how they were to be achieved. It would be a system which married high levels of accountability with high levels of autonomy, a system where the good ideas would crowd out the bad. Why? Because we simply do not yet know what works and what does not work. And that is why we're here today. I hope that there are some of you in the audience, and I sense there are, who agree with what we're doing at Michaela. You want or you believe in a traditional liberal education. You believe that nothing is ever really learnt unless it has been memorised, and I'm slightly misquoting Aristotle here, who's been mentioned earlier, but you believe that character is the corollary of hours and hours of bloody hard work. There are others of you who disagree. You say that the current system is antiquated. You would like a more personalised system, and you're searching for those nebulous 21st century skills. My colleagues and I will disagree with you, and that's a good thing. That culture is a good thing. And there are outliers out there now. Together with the excellent local authority schools, we've got Reach Academy Feltham, King Solomon Academy, Art Conway Primary. All of these schools are showing what can be done in difficult communities that previous generations left behind. And Gove did a great deal to encourage this culture. He set up the Education Endowment Fund in 2011. He commissioned the Goldacre Report in 2012. And the inspirational events like Tom Bennett's Research Ed have fed off this space. And slowly, the bloodletters and the flat earthers are being flushed out. It now seems inconceivable that a politician could stand in front of us and say that, and actively advocate for multiple intelligences, learning styles, and brain gym. And that's what it comes down to. Would you turn back the clock? Would you want your child learning nail technology, study skills? Would you want your child doing the certificate of personal effectiveness? Would you want your child learning through look-say methods rather than systematic synthetic phonics? And would you want to work in a system with brain gym, learning hacks, multiple intelligences, prescribed and enforced by OFSTED? Add to that levels, APP grids, all of which directed from Whitehall, telling you how to mark little Johnny's homework. Ladies and gentlemen, the argument that I'm going to make today is that in 2010, the system was in dire straits. There were too many bad ideas and practices in the system, and these were ruthlessly enforced by OFSTED and OFSTED inspectors who themselves, we know, may not necessarily have known any better. There had been negligible progress between 1997 and 2010, despite a doubling in education funding. And it was into this important context, a stagnant intellectual monopoly, that Gove came. And he did two momentous things. He raised expectations. He said our poor children can do what our rich children can do. And secondly, he created, he cultivated a teacher-led system that had evidence, not prejudice, at its heart. That is why Michael Gove was a great education secretary.
I didn't want to bang the gavel, but he stopped on his own, so well done. Now to speak against the G-man, it's another G-man, Francis Gilbert.
I suppose to sort of answer this question, one has to think, what actually makes a great politician. And definitions of greatness are going to vary widely. And some people would argue that no politician can be great. I would like to posit some values that could be construed as the components of greatness in a politician. If you were to look, say, to someone like Mandela as your kind of example. And the three kind of key things I want to look at are effectiveness, being a forward thinker, and being a unifying figure. I think that those three things make together perhaps what one might call a great politician. With effectiveness, I'll just go through that now. Gove's big legacy is massive structural change. His academies and free schools programme was his big policy. But was it actually needed? The statistics suggest not. It was not a cost-effective programme. Billions was spent getting local authority schools to convert to academy status. Yet research carried out by the Local Schools Network and others, the Academy's RSA research review, suggests that it didn't necessarily raise standards. Similarly, the free schools programme has not delivered in the way that I think Gove wanted. Many of them have been set up in areas where they're not needed and have not been educationally effective. Problems caused by a rising role in quite a lot of our urban areas have not been addressed by the opening of free schools. And the sidelining of LAs in addressing the problem has led to the ridiculous situation of Whitehall trying to address the shortage of school places in far-flung northern cities. It's bureaucratic madness. There is a staff recruitment crisis as we speak, which has not been addressed by Gove's reforms to teacher training. His decision to funnel trainees through schools rather than universities has resulted in admin chaos and serious recruitment problems. And his performance-related pay, another plank, has been shown by his own thing that he set up, the Educational Endowment Fund, as not being effective. And it just doesn't raise standards. It's not as effective as certain key teaching techniques, and the Educational Endowment Foundation shows that. Changes to the school curriculum have resulted, which I've been seeing as I've been going around schools, in real chaos and confusion about what should be taught, and an overall diminution of standards, as well as demoralisation amongst the profession because he didn't consult over that. Forward thinking. Gove is not a forward-thinking politician. He's trapped in ideas of the past. His slavish devotion to neoliberal ideas makes his work tiresomely predictable. He is, like the Tory government generally, a neoliberal puppet, a person who has a misplaced faith in marketisation and capitalist economics. And yet we know that unbridled markets don't work in the educational arena. Marketisation is shown to have destructive effects in many ways. And he's also been part, I think it's very important, of a government that has had a systematic attack on the poor. We see now at the moment George Osborne trying to push through changes to benefits for working credits for poor people that will have a huge impact on the attainment of poor people overall. And I think that's another thing that's kind of consistently ignored in these debates. He wasn't forward-thinking in terms of curriculum or assessment. He has a misplaced faith in exams, not realising the huge backwash that's created from an exam system is very harmful to students. It means there's constant teaching to the test, and the exams he set up are Victorian. He has not thought in making learning relevant to young people, and he doesn't trust teachers to find more appropriate methods for assessment. Being a unifying figure. Gove did not bring the teaching profession with him. He's a very divisive figure, demonising many teachers as being part of what he called the blob, enemies of promise, when they were trying their best. And having gone into many schools, you see that. They are really trying their best. And he's created a climate of fear and terror in many schools, which is not pleasant to behold. students and teachers motivated by anxiety that they'll be punished if they fail. And just this weekend we saw the inquest of a teacher who killed herself because of a bad OFSTED report. So he's pitted schools against each other in a kind of competitive market system when we know best practice happens when schools collaborate. So the London Challenge did raise the standards for poor people, but poor children, but it did so by getting schools to collaborate. Those sorts of collaborations have just been disbanded. And the one borough that really did well with raising standards amongst poor people was Tower Hamlets, and that was a local authority set up overall. So, and I think the other thing is he didn't support teachers with pay. I think there were significant issues about their conditions of service, and they didn't have proper pay rises over his tenure. And as a result, many teachers struggled to make ends meet. He is and still is, hated by the vast majority of students, teachers and parents. This was why he was sacked by his own government, and he was seen as such a toxic figure. Can someone as incompetent, divisive and extreme as him be called great? I think not. I rest my case.
Thank you, Francis. And now to address some of Francis's points, Johnny.
OK, Francis has said quite a lot there, so I'll try and break it down. He made 3 points. He made an argument about effectiveness, one about forward thinking, and the third was about bringing the profession together. First, on the issue of effectiveness, he's made the point that free schools were more expensive and they were a poor use of public money. The stats and the evidence does not actually bear that out. We know that 30% free schools are 30% cheaper than their equivalent building schools for the future. We know that free schools are 84% located in areas of need. We know that they're 3 times oversubscribed. And we also know from recent policy exchange papers that the existence of free schools nearby is almost always associated with an increase in schools' results in the locality. So it isn't just, this is a sort of canard that is often said, that free schools take the best from the local area, pull off the sort of cream, and that's why, of course, that they are so successful. The evidence just does not bear that out. There's one of the other points of his argument. He said that Gove wasn't forward-thinking. Well, I mean, the first thing that struck me about that was that he cited evidence from the Education Endowment Fund for his point, which of course was a fund set up by Michael Gove exactly so that the profession could be more forward-thinking. I made the argument in my opening that it was actually very retrograde, and that there wasn't enough forward-thinking, and that Michael Gove had the good sense to bring more enterprise and, more importantly, more evidence into the profession. And for exactly the reasons that we've just seen, we now have the evidence that Francis cited. I think there's another issue there when it comes to this idea of whether Michael Gove was forward-thinking enough. If we want our children, all our children, even the children that are in the poorest boroughs of our country, to lead the sort of lives that we want them to lead, to have the choices that we want them to have, to open the doors, to be able to open the doors that we want them to have, perversely, we sometimes have to look backwards. And we need to look at the quality of our curriculum. And Michael Gove was absolutely right to increase the breadth of the curriculum in subjects like English and history, and in subjects like maths and science to challenge our pupils more at the top end. Because if we want to be forward-thinking, we want a country where our poorest children can do what our richest children can do, they need the sort of curriculum that their peers in grammar schools and in private schools have. There is nothing that is more forward-thinking than that. And his last point was that Gove was a bad education secretary because he didn't bring the profession together. Now, I conceded right at the beginning that Michael Gove wasn't a perfect education secretary, and one of the reasons for that was that he was often a bad advocate for a good cause. He had that sort of journalistic style that did not often endear him to all of our profession. But there are, because they're sitting in this room, people who obviously didn't feel totally alienated by his rhetoric. And I want to think about another 20th century politician who had to reform an important public service, often, actually in the face of huge opposition, both from the public service that he was reforming and also within the opposition benches as well as some of his own benches, a public service that tended to the very, very same groups of marginalised people that Michael Gove wanted to tend to, and who, like Michael Gove, was sacked partly because of his rhetoric and because of his interactions with that service. And of course, I'm thinking of Nye Bevan. Michael Gove will be remembered in the same way that Nye Bevan is remembered now. At the time, we look at we're not far enough away from the rhetoric and from the hullabaloo that has been created by his time. And I'm certain that we will be able to say, even if we can't now, that in 20, 30, 40 years, that Michael Gove, because his reforms changed the system, not just in the next year or two, but for generations to come, that he was, like Nye Bevan, a great education secretary.
I find it rather ironic you're invoking Nye Bevan, who really did try and bring people together to build a national health service, when what Gove has done is privatised and sold off our school system, as far as I can see it, and made it pretty unaccountable to the local communities in which many of these schools are there. Let's address some of these points. First, I think the 2 points you were making, weren't they? The lifted expectations and the innovation point. I would disagree. I don't think he's lifted expectations, because in order to lift expectations, you do need to bring the profession, the people you're trying to lift the expectations of, with you. And he didn't. He didn't consult over the new exams that are going to kick in 2017. And we don't know how they will play out. So at the moment, we're at the tail end of the old GCSE system. And I have to say, in all these arguments, I'm no defender of New Labour. I think what they did was pretty catastrophic too. And what Gove has done is pretty catastrophic, because what you've got is a system of politicians meddling with the profession. That's what you've got. And the National Literacy Strategy was a disaster, billions tossed down the bin. We've seen Academies and Free Schools programme, billions tossed down the bin, no actual real progress amongst pupils for it. He hasn't lifted expectations. He's just demoralised people by saying you've got to now follow this particular curriculum. And looking at the ways in which, as a teacher trainer now, going in and out of quite a lot of schools, the ways in which this new curriculum is being taught, it is quite depressing. It's not innovative in the way that you're talking about, the way it's playing out. The backwash from these sort of very high stakes exams that you put in place is massive, and you get this kind of really tedious teaching to the test, which doesn't nurture the vital things that we need amongst our students, which is independent reading and writing and clear critical thinking. So I don't think that the idea of lifting expectations hangs up at all. Innovation, I don't think it is the place for a politician to be dictating what sorts of innovation goes on in a classroom. That is where you need to bring teachers on board. We know that from the National Literacy Strategy, because once again you had a Whitehall initiative imposed upon teachers, didn't bring the profession with them, and you know, as I tweeted a picture a couple of weeks ago, just massive bin bags of all the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that we were given at that time all thrown out. And I suspect, you know, all the kind of syllabuses and exams that Gove has put in place in 10 years' time, we'll be seeing the same kind of binning of it, because we'll have found out it doesn't actually work. What works is when, as Paul Black said, is when you get teachers in a room coming together, talking about what works with their students and figuring out and having time to think about how we're going to improve the life chances of our young people. That's what works. Thinking about pedagogy and empowering us to actually figure out what's best for the students in front of us. And I don't think anything Gove has done has actually nurtured that. That's what, you know, I think is the key here. The Free Schools programme, well, it's a tiny programme. I'm really impressed by Michaela. I really liked what Katie said about OFSTED. I totally 100% agree with it, you know, and I really like the feeling I get from Catherine that she's acting as a head teacher, as a buffer against much of the kind of nonsense that's been flung at schools, which is great. But unfortunately, we don't have enough schools like that. And that we obviously will have people, exceptional people like Catherine, running schools like this who can act as a buffer against the nonsense. But by and large, most teachers and head teachers are human beings trying to do the best that they can. And I don't think we can expect superheroes in all of our schools. And I think what we need is a structural system that plays back and actually stops the climate of fear, stops the kind of high stakes testing that we've got, and thinks about some sort of intelligent accountability, which is a nice word that I really like. The head teachers round table are beginning to talk about what is a good way of making schools accountable that doesn't actually instill the kind of fear that leads a head teacher to committing suicide because they've got a bad Ofsted report. And that's what we need to do. Gove did nothing. He did nothing to address that, okay? You just need to go around some schools to see that being played out. He was a man who was a bully. He pushed through these reforms that were not part of a coalition government, weren't part of his actual mandate to do, and he furthered a climate of fear that was already there under New Labour, and he made it worse. I think you just need to go around a few schools to see that happen. So he definitely wasn't great.
Does anybody have any questions?
OK, just a few points about privatising education. I do think that he has privatised education in the sense that a lot of the resources and power has moved to the academy chains and to the free schools movement, which are there's a definite lack of transparency there in a way that there wasn't under the old local authority system, where you had a kind of democratically elected people deciding what to do within the communities. And I think it is effectively privatising. And then you look at the eye-watering kind of sums that the people who are leading the chains are paying themselves, and effectively very unaccountable. Yeah, there was a point about Catherine and leadership, and you know that Gove was supportive of this particular school. I mean, that's great, but I think that there are many examples of inspirational heads as well within local authority frameworks. I do think you need to set up a system where it's not just the fact that you're going to be a favoured person within central government that enables you to become an effective leader. And I think that the problem with Gove is he did have his favourites and ignored, you know, perhaps 75% of the rest of the profession. There's a few points about knowledge. I do think that we need to empower teachers to have these sorts of discussions, and I think it is actually quite ridiculous to have a Secretary of State kind of telling teachers how and what they should be teaching. I think that we need to set teachers free so they can have these sorts of discussions about what's appropriate to teach, and I don't think Gove did that at all. It's a very, as Kevin was saying, it's a very technocratic system that I'm seeing within schools, and it's not helping children learn. Yeah, I think there were repeated points about that he failed to bring the teaching profession with him. And I agree that you don't necessarily have to have total consensus with all stakeholders in order to get a policy through, but you do need consensus within the vital deliverers of what you want to do. And he didn't have that, did he? He remains a very unpopular figure within the teaching profession. What we're going through, just looking at, I think that's, yeah, we were talking about kind of neoliberalism. I think that he is a kind of a neoliberal policy maker, isn't he, par excellence. And what he does is he's pushed through a kind of neoliberal agenda, which is much more extreme than we've ever seen in any kind of educational setting within England, at least, and adopting kind of many of the kind of marketisation ideas that you find in the States, in certain states within the States. So, and that is something that was there before. I think perhaps since 1988 it's been there, hasn't it, as a kind of competition between schools. Overall, he's been had a really demoralising effect on the profession, and I think one just needs to look at the big picture of what's happening in England at the moment with the massive recruitment crisis and the demoralisation of the profession. It's not working. And we're going to need someone who is a genuinely kind of unifying figure, a visionary figure, to kind of stop the climate of fear that's going on in schools and give teachers the freedom to teach what they feel is kind of appropriate with the children they've got and give them the training to enable them to be really effective. I think that's where a kind of politician needs to be. Actually, they've got to be quite boring and low-key and devolve quite a lot of power down to schools, which is something I don't think, for all the rhetoric, Gove ever did.
Okay, thanks. I just want to quickly come back on a couple of those points in summary. Often the issue of recruitment is serious, and it's absolutely right that people are concerned about it and we're talking about it. But to turn it into a political issue, I think is a mistake. I think there are very complicated macroeconomic issues related to it. And I'd also point to the fact that the teacher recruitment issue is worse in Scotland than it is in England. Of course, a jurisdiction that wasn't in any way affected by Gove's reforms. Francis also said at one point, referred to he seemed to imply that there was actually a sort of friendly relationship between Nye Bevan and the BMA at the time. I remembered the quotation. Nye Bevan on the BMA referred to them as a small body of politically poisoned people. Hardly friendly. I will try and respond to those questions. The first question was about his announcement of the EBAC on TV. I conceded right at the beginning that some of his rhetoric was misguided, often unhelpful. I know that there were these, and on the issue of this particular issue, my knowledge is actually not very good, so I'll try to do my best. But he often leaked things or spoke to the Sunday Times, and that was how people found out about the information. I couldn't possibly condone that, and I totally agree that that's something that we should criticise him for. The point about him fostering a more technocratic system, I'm not sure that the technocratic system necessarily came from his reforms. I totally agree with you that there is a technocratic problem out there. I would want to see reform of OFSTED, because I feel that OFSTED is what drives a lot of the perverse incentives that those middle managers and senior managers in those academy chains and local authority schools are trying to get towards. And I think you answered the question yourself. We need to have a teacher-led system where we, in local authority schools, free schools or academies, say this is good teaching. And the great thing that Gove, of course, did was he reformed Ofsted. So he said, I'm not going to... he put pressure on Ofsted and said, you should not judge teachers about how they teach. You should judge them on their outcomes. And that is a massive, massive Ofsted policy shift that's happened in the last 2 or 3 years, which will, in time, have, I hope, an effect on teaching style. And a lot of these technocratic issues are related to teaching style, I feel. I mean, if anyone's interested to see a teaching style that is light years away from many schools, come to Michaela, because I basically just talk at them for about an hour. Lack of support. I agree that he should have thought more about the middle tier. It's, you know, the can't remember the name for it now. Regional Schools Commission, RSC. Yeah. I think it's an answer to a question that should already have been answered. You know, it took too long, and it's something that the coalition government should have thought about as they were implementing these reforms. But do I think that having the principle of a more heterogeneous system was a good one? Absolutely. And they should have thought more at the time about how they were going to disperse good practice around the system. On the phonics tests, I think it takes time. I think there are lots of people out there who are thinking, how can we persuade people that phonics is the best way to teach children how to read? But I think the reality is that there are people that are just stuck in their ways often. And I would say, I think that applies to all sorts of people with all sorts of views about how to teach. And I think it just takes time for people to change their views on things. You have to read widely, and you have to see it working. You have to you have to have those petri dishes of innovation to show you that, oh, actually, yeah, no, a knowledge curriculum does work, or a character curriculum does work, or a School 21 style of creative education does work. And listen, I will be the first person to hold up my hand if, in 10 years' time, the so-called traditional education system has failed our poorest children, and their GCSE results are shocking, and they all turn out to be megalomaniacs. I will say the argument has been lost, and that is what he created. He created a system where that discussion can happen. Failure of free school in Suffolk. Again, I'm not a subject expert on the intricacies of that process in the early years. What I am aware of is that the first free schools did not go through an accountability sort of process that they are now. And yes, I think you're right to criticise that. So I've made the argument today that Michael Gove did two things: that he raised expectations, and that he created this system that we're enjoying today, in fact, where enterprise, innovation, and discussion and evidence can flourish. I think that throughout the discussion today, Francis has underestimated or not given enough consideration to the context in 2010. It was a stagnant culture of ideas, and it combined in places, not everywhere, with low expectations and the pseudoscience that was enforced pretty ruthlessly by OFSTED. And we still have schools, even to this day, with appalling behaviour, and with teachers who, when they do discipline children, are told off by their senior leaders. We still have look-say methods, and we still have a situation where, in some places, if you're poor, or you're an immigrant, or you find it difficult to read, then some teacher somewhere is going to tell you that Shakespeare and Mozart and Newton just are not appropriate for you. They're not relevant to you. I think that's wrong. I think it's academically wrong. I think it's morally wrong. And I think that Gove challenged that system, and the benefits of which will be felt for generations to come. That is why he was a great education secretary.